For your next business, like, is hardware out, or depends on what it is?
Yeah, hardware is definitely out. I think I eventually got to the point where I felt really comfortable with it, but there were so many points where I was like, this wouldn't be a problem if it was all digital, if it was all software. So the blog post I wrote about selling TinyPilot, one of the Hacker News comments was like, oh, like he actually made a bad choice because had he just stayed at Google, he would have made more money. And I'm like, well, no, like I'm not optimizing for most money. Like it's more satisfying to me to make $200,000 a year and knowing that I'm capturing the full value of that, rather than like maybe I'm working for Google and I'm making $400,000 a year, but I feel like I'm actually generating like $2 million in value. And so I'm like, oh, that sucks that like I'm not really getting the full value of what I'm doing. And I'm like giving so much of my work to somebody else because they're in this position of employer.
For someone who might be starting on this journey, it's like, you know what, I like electronics, I want to put a board together and maybe even sell it to a consumer. What would you ask them to think more about?
How to discourage them from doing it? Is that
Well,
Yeah,
the advice cannot be don't do it. I'll preface that.
If I can't say don't do it, I mean, I don't think that it is a blanket don't do it, but I think it is really important to recognize that there are a lot of existential risks in hardware, because a lot of times with TinyPilot, I would have to invest pretty much all of the cash we had on hand into the next batch of something.
Welcome to the Software Misadventures podcast. We are your hosts, Ronak and Guan. As engineers, we are interested in not just the technologies, but the people and the stories behind them. So on this show, we try to scratch our own itch by sitting down with engineers, founders, and investors to chat about their path, lessons they have learned, and of course, the misadventures along the way.
Welcome back to the show, Michael. Super excited to catch up.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be back. This was so much fun last time.
Nice. Okay, so back in 2018, 6 years ago, you quit Google to work for yourself, or indie hacking before it was cool. So the first 2 years, you were trying a bunch of different projects and made negative profit. But then in year 3, you started working on TinyPilot, which over the past years, you grew to a team of 7 people with $1 million in annual revenue. And in April, you actually sold the company for $600K. Big congrats.
Thank you.
I've been following your journey for years, so like I'm really I'm super happy for you.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm sure you've done a lot of like introspections in like the last month or two.
Yeah.
Did you learn anything new about yourself, like having gone through this process now?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. This isn't something I learned about me, but like one of the things that I learned just about running a business and the process of handing it over, it's like a living thing. Like every job I've had before, I could quit if I wanted to. Like when I worked at Google or Microsoft, I was like, I'm tired of this, and so I'm just going to leave. With TinyPilot, there was this feeling that I had built up something that I thought was worth $600,000 or something in that range, and that was the valuation I heard from brokers. But it was only worth that if I could complete the transaction. Like there's no like, I'm tired of this, I quit, because then it's worth zero. And so it really did affect the way that I think about businesses and the way that I think about what the transition will be like if I do it in the future. Like I think TinyPilot ended up being more complicated than I realized it would be at the beginning. Like at the beginning, I thought it was going to be mostly like a software business. I thought I would sell people software and the hardware would be secondary. And then it turned out to be much more focused on the hardware. And so just seeing like how much that I could build a business for myself that was actually pretty complex to sell to somebody else, and like what that position feels like, it did affect my planning for future businesses of like, okay, like if there is complexity, there's not just like the overhead of running a business that's complex. There's also, it's going to be that much harder to exit if I get to the point of wanting to exit.
is that part of complexity, like also just having like people now involved, like on the team and having to figure out like what that transition will like for them, like that also makes things more complicated?
The people were actually the easiest part, I think. The team, because the way that TinyPilot had been set up was pretty. All the teams were pretty self-directed, so it was 3 separate teams of 2 people. There were 2 developers, 2 support engineers, and 2 customer service staff. And so their day-to-day, they had workflows that they knew how to run themselves. And so transitioning them to a new owner, that part was pretty easy. I think it was just the complexity was all of the moving pieces that need to fit together between like the vendors and the like our distributor and the people that help design the hardware. And there's with a hardware business, there's just so many like little moving pieces, and making sure you transition them to the new owner and everything's going to be in a good place. I think that was the hardest part.
I see. Actually, for people that haven't that didn't listen to the first episode, could you give like a quick recap in terms of like the different pieces? Because I did read about, right, it is quite complex.
Sure.
You have like vendors you need to work with, like
So just as a bit of background, TinyPilot, the product was a device that you plug into a computer and it lets you control the computer remotely. And so we had for a long time, we were doing 3D printing of the cases and assembling everything in our office in Massachusetts. In 2023, we switched to a contract manufacturer. So they ended up handling the whole end-to-end of manufacturing circuit boards and manufacturing the cases and assembling everything and flashing the software. So there was that piece. There was also the 3PL, which is a third-party logistics vendor. They're the warehouse that when orders come in, they pack up the order and ship it out. We had a distributor in Europe, and so we had to make sure that they also continue to have access to the hardware from the contract manufacturer and from the new owner. Those were the major vendors that we worked with.
So you said like this kind of changed your thinking around like what's the criteria for the next business to kind of reduce the complexity. Like have you refined like the sort of what are the attributes you're looking for as you build out the next
I
thing?
would like it to be something where I could probably run it with a team that's me and maybe 1 or 2 other people. I think once you get beyond that, there's a lot of work that goes into management. And I like management. I like working with people, especially mentoring people. And like when developers on the team, I could help them grow. That was really satisfying, and like help them with their career goals. But I love coding. Like I really want to write code myself. And so when I was managing 6 people and managing relationships with all the vendors, there was really very little time to actually write code. And so I would just like see the developers writing code and being like, I want to do that too. So I think the next thing, like I would want to set it up so that there's bandwidth so that I can
What a swap.
I can write code myself and take more of a hands-on role in the technical development.
So we got a chance to talk with Brian Cantrell?
Yeah, from Oxide.
Yes.
Right. So then, we're talking about like, it's much harder to build a company that's both hardware and software, but it is a much more enduring business. And I feel like TinyPilot is in many ways, right, like it's both software and also hardware.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's, I feel like, right, it's a pain in the ass to like build a hardware product. So like,
definitely.
I guess for your next business, like is hardware out or, depends on, I guess, what it is.
Yeah, hardware's definitely out. I think I eventually got to the point where I felt really comfortable with it, but there were so many points where I was like, this wouldn't be a problem if it was all digital, if it was all software. And a lot of the things like aren't, it's kind of irrational on my point, on my end, but I would get complaints from customers that were like, hey, like USPS says this was delivered, but it never was. And I'm like,
wow.
Yeah, but I can't do anything about that. Like we would work with them.
UPS's problem.
But I was always thinking like, oh man, like this is like a SaaS product. There's no way they can be like, hey, like Comcast said it delivered these bytes to me, but they didn't really arrive. I'd be like, well,
We can check.
yeah. So it's just, it wasn't even that frequent that customers had issues with shipping, but whenever it happened, and like also I wasn't really even in the critical path for that. Like the customer service team knew how to take care of those issues. But sometimes when it would have to escalate to me, I found it really demoralizing. I think it's not rational how much it bothered me. But there were people that would be upset in ways that I found, like especially Amazon customers, because we would sell through Amazon even though we were fulfilling ourselves. And a lot of customers don't really see the distinction between buying a product from Amazon fulfilled by Amazon and buying a product that's a third-party product fulfilled by the merchant. And so they would email us and say things like, tell the driver to put it on the table next to my front door. And I was like, what? Like, even when you order from Amazon for real, you don't get that level of control. Like, what are you talking about? And we would try to work with them and try to keep them happy. But a lot of these things that you deal with in physical products are things that were kind of my least favorite parts of the business. And so in the future, I think I'm going to try to do something that's purely digital or a SaaS or something. But it is unfortunate because I feel like I learned so many hard lessons about shipping a hardware product or at least shipping a physical product. And I don't know what to do with all that knowledge now. Like I can't really, there's not that many people that are like making custom hardware at my scale, because like it's really hard to bootstrap that. I think I got pretty lucky in that I was able to kind of catch enough lucky breaks that I was able to get to a point of scale, but it is really hard to make custom hardware.
In this case, like from a scale perspective, what did that scale look like?
There were a few different points where we could make a shift. So in the very beginning, I was just selling a kit of off-the-shelf parts. Mm-hmm. And then the next step after that was we wanted to make it so that the customer could, instead of relying on power from the computer, which wasn't actually producing enough power to meet it was built on Raspberry Pi. And so Raspberry Pi actually has a pretty high voltage requirement. I think it requires 5 volts, 3 amps. And like the USB port on your computer, even USB 3, I think it's only like 1.2 amps, something pretty low. And so the Raspberry Pi can get by on it, but I didn't want to sell a product based on that because I knew if there started to be hardware issues in the future, I would always wonder like, oh, is it because I'm telling people to run it on like lower power? And so I found these electrical engineers like kind of through chance. Like it was another founder that I had been in this peer support group with, and he was like, oh, I know these electrical engineers that might be able to help you. And so they made this circuit board for me that was like this tiny little thing, like maybe the size of a matchbook. And we worked with a 3D printing shop to make a little 3D printed case for that. And so that was like a very cheap thing to make. But as we went on, it was like, okay, well, what if we want to put that little circuit board in the device itself? So it's not like a Raspberry Pi and then a separate thing. And then it would kind of iterate on like that, where it was like, okay, well, now we want to support audio. And that makes it a little bit more complicated, like capturing audio as well. And then when we got to the point of switching to a contract manufacturer, the contract manufacturer isn't going to be like, oh, sure, like I'll manufacture like 50 a month for you. Like they need to be on the scale of like thousands. And so we couldn't have done that in the beginning. And so we really needed to do a lot of the like do it yourself. Like, and that was the other thing. Like originally it was my then girlfriend, now wife, we were like at home and she was the first employee and she would build the devices in our house. And then we got to the point of like, okay, well, we want to be able to take a vacation. And so we need other people that can keep working if we're on vacation. So like getting to the point where we can afford an office and can afford to hire employees that will staff the office. And then it kind of kept going like that. Just like we would make enough revenue to get to the next level of like, okay, now we can like, we can automate this a little bit more, like outsource a little bit more of this work to get to more scale.
And in this specific, go ahead, Ron.
Sorry, just do my little joke here. When when you got your then girlfriend to be the employee, like, do you change the label to family business? Sorry, I'll stop. I'll shut up. I'll shut up. Please, Ronak, please go.
Yeah, we didn't figure it into the branding.
Congratulations, by the way. Guang,
Oh, thank you.
where are your manners? Sorry, jokes aside. In this specific case, like you mentioned, you would probably not do hardware again because of all these challenges, but you have so many lessons
Yeah.
you have learned through this. There might be
Yeah.
some, let's just say, crazy people out there who want to learn from their own mistakes and would be wanting to do hardware. And in this specific case, if I got it right, you're selling direct to consumers. It's not like you're selling to like some vendors or third party. Like individual people are actually ordering these devices.
Right. Yeah, we had one distributor that would order in bulk, but that was for Europe, and then in the US we would sell in the US and everywhere else we would sell directly to the consumers.
So I don't know of many people who are trying to build physical products like this, especially in the embedded
Yeah.
system space, and they are selling
Yeah.
direct to consumers. So I want to talk about some of the scale aspects there too. But in this case, for someone who might be starting on this journey, it's like, you know what, I like electronics. I want to put a board together and maybe even sell it to a consumer who might want to take it to the scale you took it to. What are some of the lessons that they could learn from, or in other words, what would you ask them to think more about, or some lessons that you could share with them?
How to discourage them from doing it? Is that
Well,
Yeah,
the advice cannot be don't do it. I'll preface that.
I mean, if I can't say don't do it, I don't think that it is a blanket don't do it, but I think it is really important to recognize that there are a lot of existential risks in hardware, because a lot of times with TinyPilot, I would have to invest pretty much all of the cash we had on hand into the next batch of something. So it'd be like, oh, we want to make this improvement for V2, but in order to make a V2, we have to pay the electrical engineers like $60,000 in their hourly time, and then we need to buy all these supplies. We for hardware, you can't just say like, hey, I want to make 200 of these. You really have to buy components that you're going to make like a year or 3 years worth of it. And so it gets very risky. Like, fortunately, a lot of components that you have to buy are like on the order of cents per unit, or like a few cents per device. But some of them would be pretty expensive, like 50 or like $1.50, 50 cents or $1.50 per unit. And so if you're buying like 3,000 of those and you get it wrong, that's a big risk. And there's just like a lot of things that I didn't anticipate at the beginning that could sink the business. So like things like we did run into this. We tried switching to a new circuit board manufacturer because in the beginning we were doing the assembly ourselves, but we were finding PCB manufacturers to assemble, or to get the circuit boards printed and then assemble the PCBs and do all the soldering and stuff. But we had one where we were trying to switch from China to the US, and I was like, well, there's a lot of risks with China, just geopolitical and shipping and communication barriers. Let's try like finding a shop in the US where the turnaround time could be much lower. And then they ended up ruining an entire batch of a product, and like there's not really much we can do. Wow. They gave us a refund, but they still, like, we lose all the materials that we sent to them, and we were like, okay, like we'll try it again. And then the same thing happened. They ended up having manufacturing defect, and so we couldn't use any of the results.
Oh, that sucks.
And so fortunately we had tested them on a pretty small scale, like just in case something like that happened. But there were times where I didn't really have the flexibility to do that, where we were like betting big on like, okay, this next batch has to work, or else we're going to lose $50,000, or like we're going to lose all the money that we need to make it through the year. And then there's things like just get like a lot of the shops that do assembly or manufacturing PCBs, they're overseas, like to get to an affordable rate, like you're working with China or Vietnam or in the Philippines. And so like there's risks of something getting lost or damaged when they ship. There's risks of customs taking it or charging you like a surprising fee. We had one thing, I don't even remember what this component was, but we had to order like $14,000 of this component from China. And to prototype. We had to ship it. We had to get it shipped to the US, and we got it, and they were the customs was like $3,000 on it. I was like, oh man, like that's not what I was expecting.
Yeah.
And then we ended up having to ship it back to China after the prototypes were done. And so I think we had to pay customs again. And it's just, yeah. So,
Wow.
I mean, my biggest piece of advice is just recognizing like how much risk there is in doing iterations and being forced to carry inventory, because if you're in a physical product, like you have to, a lot of your money is going to be tied up in inventory, and that puts a strain on cash if you're just starting out. So my biggest advice would be just to be aware of the risks and make sure you're not risking more than you mean to.
Speaking of inventory, I think one of the blog posts, we'll like link it in the show notes, right? Was you started with the most terrifying 10 minutes of 2023.
Oh,
Do
yeah.
you want to quickly go through that?
Yeah. So it was like a time in TinyPilot where things were going pretty smoothly. And I think it was just like a Saturday morning and I'm in my pajamas, and then somebody knocks on my door, which is really unusual. And so I go to my door, and it's this guy I've never seen before. He's like a middle-aged guy, and he's like, "Are you the TinyPilot guy?" And I was like, what is this? And my first thought was like, is this a disgruntled customer who tracked down my home address? And like, what's happening? And so I'm like, yeah. And he's like, there's a flood at the office. You got to get down there. And I was like, oh God. And he's like, yeah, I'm the handyman for the office. And I was like, oh gosh. And I live actually like very close to the TinyPilot office. And so I just drove down there, and like the entire drive, I'm like, oh God, this is before we switched to the contract manufacturer. So all of our inventory was in that office, and we had renter's insurance, but like I got it when I first moved in. So I think we had like $20,000 of coverage, and we probably had maybe $40,000 worth of inventory, but it also meant like, if that was destroyed, we don't just lose $40,000. We lose that plus like being unable to sell anything for 6 months.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I was like, oh God, like what's going to happen if the office is just totally flooded? And I get there, and like so lucky. It turned out it was the office right next to ours that flooded. And so I opened the door to our office, and it was completely dry. Like the water came within like an inch of our doorway and just didn't go in at all. And so I was so relieved, but I was like, wow, we really need to, like, I really can't bet everything on this office. And that was like a huge motivation in, we need to ship operations to a third-party logistics vendor. So like, we're not the single point of failure. I mean, we're still at risk of that if the 3PL floods or catches on fire, but it's more like somebody else's problem to fix. Like that was the other problem, was like after it flooded, they're like, well, it flooded because a sprinkler exploded. And so now due to fire safety, like you can't go in the building. So I'm like, okay, well, it's pretty hard for us to ship anything if we can't go into the office. And fortunately, they were able to get it wrapped up in a week. But it was also the same week I was about to take my longest vacation from TinyPilot. I was going to Europe for a wedding, so I was going to be gone for 2 weeks. And I was like, oh man, like, what do I do if they have to, like the other employees, like I was the IT guy. Nobody else knew how to set up the network and all the computers and the printer and stuff. And so they can't print, they can't ship. And so fortunately, we ended up not having to move offices, and it was fine. But it was definitely like, okay, this is one of the risks I want to minimize. This is one of the things I want to try to make somebody else's problem if something like this comes up in the future.
So that is a close call. In this case, like, how do you go about deciding the pricing, for example, per unit?
We talked about this last time, where I was just like, I don't know. I said that like every time I raised the price, I just thought like, that's too high. And then I would raise the price to that level, and then people would still buy, and I would go, oh, okay, I guess it wasn't too high. Yeah. But really in the beginning, it was like, okay, I want to make $100 on each unit, just because I think that's going to be like what it would be worth it to me to like pack a box. And I thought I had to bring it to the post office. Turns out you don't. But then over time, it was just like, let's increase the price and see how people react. And I eventually got to a point where I did notice sales start to slow down with higher prices, but that's also really hard to tell, because we were generally selling between like 100 and 150 units per month. And so there's a lot of noise to that. Like if you raise the price and then the quantity goes down, it could be because of the price or it could be something else. And for complicated reasons, like our tech stack for the Shopify store was not in a position to do like real A/B testing where we could in parallel test different prices. So it was mainly just like I would change the price and then let it run for like a week or two, and just kind of like a lot of it was gut feeling. Sometimes I would do analyses on my blog and say like, okay, we sold a little bit more at this price. And then I realized ultimately like the thing that I wasn't trying to optimize for most sales or most revenue, but rather most profit. And that changed the way I thought about it too, because I realized that I could maximize revenue, but then it's also more customers to support. I think for a lot of SaaS businesses, like profitability and revenue are so close that they could just look at revenue and not really care. Yeah. But for TinyPilot, if we sold a device for, I think it was $400 for the lower end and $500 for the higher end, but the cost to us to make those was like usually like between like $130 and $150 per unit. And so it's a pretty big chunk going just to the hardware. And then there's also the cost of supporting those customers. And so like you estimate that, okay, like over the course of this person's use of TinyPilot, maybe we're going to spend like $30 on average on supporting them. And so I would look like when I started thinking about pricing, I was like, okay, like let's just maximize revenue, because like, of course everybody wants the highest revenue. And then I was like, well, like if I could make the same profit per month and have fewer customers, that's actually better for me, because long term those customers are going to be simpler to support. So the pricing was mainly like experimenting and trying to look at the performance after and decide what would work best.
So those are the two philosophies I've also heard, where you have a slightly lower price that gives you a lot more sales, and the other one is you have a slightly higher price, you have a slightly lower sales. But if you do the math, sometimes you are better off by just increasing the price, and like you said, the overhead of everything else you have to deal with goes down.
Yeah.
And I've heard this from also many people who specifically cater to just what they would call as like premium customers, where they're like, I charge a premium and I only deal with them, and I deal with like a percentage of customers my peers would deal with, and that's a choice they make. Considering the type of business, obviously this may or may not work. In general, where do you see this kind of strategy working better?
The strategy of going for like lower sales
and higher price,
higher profit.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, my experience is pretty limited to just mainly TinyPilot is the only business I've run like profitably. So for that, I think it was a good match. I think there is value in having a lot of customers to just sort of like win mind share. And so that's why TinyPilot was open source. It was based on an open core model. So when I initially made the prototype that was off the shelf parts, I published all the source, and so people could just make it themselves without paying me anything. And we kept that throughout, and we always made sure that people could build it themselves for free. And so my thinking there was that if somebody used like a basic version in their home lab setup, they could say like, hey, I like this. And then when maybe they have a job in IT and they go to their team and they say, hey, like I've used the open source version of this. Like, I think it would be cool to get a paid version. But in terms of, I think for a lot of indie businesses, like the small customers, higher profit probably is like for almost everybody is probably going to be the best match, because if you're small and you're bootstrapped, like you have very limited resources. And so like supporting, if it's a choice between like having 1x or 10x the customers, even if the profit is slightly higher at 10x, like just the amount of time you can spend per day on things that you're interested in is so much higher if you're just supporting a smaller number of customers. And one of the things that I've heard a lot and also found true with TinyPilot is that the more price sensitive customers tend to also be the hardest to support. And you'd expect it to be the opposite. Like you'd expect, we would have Fortune 500 customers that would be like, hey, we want like 50 devices. And I'll be like, oh no, like they're going to have so many questions for us and like expect so much because they gave us so much money, and we just never hear from them again. Like we would maybe hear from them a year later and they want 25 more. And I'm like, how's it working for you? And they're like, it's great. Yeah, we ran into some issues, but we fixed them. And I'm like, okay, great.
That's great.
And then, yeah, then you get customers that are like, hey, can you give me a discount? Like I can't afford this. And I'm like, okay, fine. And then they have like a million feature requests. They want like white glove service. So yeah, catering to the like premium customers, I think it's not even like, you know, if you can sell like 10 times more, but 90% of them are going to be the price sensitive customers, it's not even like 10 times the work. It's like 100 times the work. So yeah, I think for indie businesses, like the way to go is small, like higher end customers.
This is something that Tim Ferriss talked. I don't know if you know Tim Ferriss, but yeah,
I read the
so the 4 hour work week. Yeah, so he I think this is one of the things he talked about quite a bit in that book, as well as whenever he shares his journey. And he shared something similar, as you said. The more price sensitive customers actually had the most amount, like they resulted in least amount of revenue / profit plus the most amount of overhead.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that at this time you had a team of 6 people. How did you go about assembling them in terms of like, so 2 dimensions that I'm thinking of right now. One is like, one, how do you find them? 2, how do you figure out what to pay them?
Yeah, I think the developers were the first hire. I think the developers were the first hire because I realized I was spending so much time on customer support that things weren't really moving forward on the software. And there was a blogger that I liked, and I think we'd just emailed back and forth, just kind of been like, hey, like you're writing about a similar thing. Like we kind of covered similar topics. So I just reached out, and then I noticed on his blog that he said he was taking freelance clients, and I was like, hey, like maybe you want to work with me on TinyPilot. And so we got started working together that way. And then I think after that, I hired people. That was in early 2021, we got the office. And so we wanted people that could staff the office and make sure that they were building new devices every day and fulfilling orders. And so for that, it was just, I put ads on, I think Facebook and Craigslist. Like we have a local Facebook group. And so I just wrote up, I think just a little Google Doc saying what the job would be. And I think what the hourly rate I offered at the time was like $16 an hour. And for that, I was surprised at like how quickly I found good people. The first 2 people that I interviewed were the first 2 hires, and they continued with the company until I sold it. So they really worked out. And then I brought in another developer a few months after that that was recommended by a friend. And then the support engineers was, I think, the piece that took me the longest to figure out, because I realized that there was, I actually don't remember the order now. The people that I hired to build devices, I eventually asked them to transition into doing customer service kind of work as well. And then especially once we outsourced to the third-party logistics warehouse and then to a contract manufacturer, there was no more building or shipping devices to be done. So their job became fully customer service. But there was always a gap between like what customer service could do and the things that like users would ask for that were technical problems, because the people that were doing customer service, like they didn't have a background in software or Linux. And so sometimes people would say like, hey, like I'm seeing this error on the command line. And then they would have to escalate that to me. And so I was like, okay, there's a gap here. Like we need to hire somebody who's like not exactly customer service, but not exactly like a developer. And so that's when I created I didn't invent this role, but support engineer.
Yeah.
And so I brought in people for support engineering. Looking back though, I think I kind of did it backwards. Like I think I should have probably outsourced. Like when I hired a developer, I was like, ooh, I'm spending so much time on customer service. Like I need a developer that can help me with the code. But like, why would you outsource like the most expensive thing? Like it would have made a lot more sense to hire somebody to help me with the customer service. Yeah. But that was a thing I learned a lot through the course of running the company, is like I kept on thinking that there were things that only I could do or that would be hard to teach somebody else to do, and then realizing like it's not really that hard to do. And so like I remember one example was like a customer was like, oh, can you send us like a custom invoice for like with our names on it and with these fields and stuff? And I was like, okay, like, you know, customer service isn't going to know how to do that. And so like I looked up templates and did it, and it took me like an hour, and then I finished and I was like, wait, customer service, like I don't have special expertise at like, I'm not like, I don't have invoice training. Like customer service, they're smart. They could have figured out the same thing that I did. And I think there were a lot of things like that where I just assumed that only I could do it, or like I felt like I was very afraid of asking people to do anything that was outside of their strict role. Like I never wanted to make people feel like I was asking them to do the unpleasant work. But I think I took that to the extreme and just like always tried to make sure they only did like what was strictly their job. And then the person that ended up doing, there's like so many gaps. Like if you're the founder, there's so many things that are like don't fall specifically in customer service or development and stuff. And I just always felt like, oh, it's like it would be unfair to ask somebody to do anything else. And when I talked to people, they were like, no, like we're fine doing this. And also like we want to do stuff like that. We want to do things that give us more insight into the business and like it advance our career more. Like it's not great for our career if we only do the same things, if we only do like exactly what we were hired for. Like we want to get more of this perspective in different parts of the business.
That seems like a tricky thing, right? Of if you're a technical solo founder, and the decision of like, okay, do you outsource stuff that you know well, so like the software side, or say like not support, but like say the business side, right? Like making like doing sales. Would you have done it differently, or would you have stuck with it?
If I had to do it again, I think I would have outsourced customer service before I outsourced development. And like outsourcing customer service doesn't mean I take myself out of it entirely. Like for almost all of TinyPilot, I was still like overseeing customer service, and I was reading every customer service message anyway. And I would jump in if I saw that the answer, like maybe if I interpreted the question different than the customer service agent that was answering it. So yeah, like I think there is risk of being too disconnected from customer service if you totally outsource it and just don't pay attention. But I think there's like a very easy middle ground there of outsourcing it. But I think the reason that I started with outsourcing developers was because I am a developer, and so I felt so much more comfortable training somebody in that. Like I know what the role's supposed to look like. Whereas I think things that were hardest for me to hire for were things where like I didn't know what a good job of it looked like. So I think we talked about like my fiasco trying to hire like a design agency. Ended up spending $46,000 on like what should not have been a $46,000 job. But for developers, it's like I know developers. I've hired developers in the past. Like I really get that part of it, but it felt harder for me to judge like customer service because I've never hired for that before, and like it's harder for me to know the difference between like somebody who's not a good fit, or like maybe I've trained them wrong, or maybe this is just like part of the learning curve. Like with a developer, it's just like I've worked with so many developers that I kind of know what somebody who's a good fit should look like early on.
And all these folks that you're working with, are they contractors or you had like full-time employees?
Everybody was part-time, so everybody worked 10 to 20 hours per week. And I mean, I didn't really distinguish between like contractor and employee. It was really just for tax reasons that certain people had to be classified one way or another. So the people that worked in the office, they were classified as employees because they legally have to be. Because just if you look up the definition of like what's an employee, like if somebody tells you where you have to be, then you're an employee. But yeah, like I didn't really, at the beginning I was kind of thinking about it. Well, like contractors have, you know, they're less tied to the business, but everybody stayed with the business for so long. It wasn't like they were just, the contractors were really different than the employees. But yeah, I definitely would try to do contractors, but there's so much red tape to hiring employees. Like it's very unfortunate that the way it works in the US is so stacked against small businesses that like there's so much paperwork, there's so much bureaucracy in just like hiring employees and paying them properly. And like, even if you're using one of those like HR as a service things, it's still such a pain. So I would try to get everybody as a contractor role, but like I didn't see them as like, oh, you're not really like invested. It's like they were all team members.
And in this case, like when you're hiring a contractor versus, let's say, a full-time employee, what resources can folks look out for in terms of like how do I draft a contract in some cases, and in case of full-time employees, like any, let's say, third-party companies that they can go through to get all the paperwork done? Because I'm assuming as a founder, like you wouldn't know everything that you would have to do if you're hiring someone as an employee.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if I actually did it right. I found contracts online and just used that. Like the advice I've heard is that, like you don't really want contracts to get to the point where you're settling things in court. Like once you get to court, like things are already pretty bad. And so like the way that I tried to draft contracts was like, it's clear to both of us. And if we ever did go to court, it would be clear to a judge what the intent was. And I'm sure if I like ran the contracts through a lawyer, they'd probably tell me like, oh, you're not covering this case or something like that. But a lot of the contracts were also people that were outside the US. So the chances of it like going to some kind of international court was pretty low. Like it was mainly like the important things for me in the contract were making sure the expectations from both sides are clear in the contract, and we're not going to run into a situation where like there are surprises of somebody's not getting paid for something they thought they were going to get paid for, or, and the work was pretty flexible. Like they chose their own hours, and they had the option of like sometimes working a little bit fewer hours or more. And so, yeah, it was the main thing that was important in the contract for most people. It was just like, this is the hourly rate. And then I had documents internally of just like, here's what I expect from you. But I probably don't have good advice for people on like how to draft an airtight contract.
So in this case, how do you track hours? Because in this case, if you're paying hourly and they are choosing their own hours, is it more like you expect something to take X amount of time and they say yes, or is it like software estimation, or is it something else?
Sometimes.
Okay.
It was hard. So we tried a few different tools. I'm not going to say them because I don't like any of the tools that we used, but it would basically just be tools that would let them say like, this is how I spent an hour doing this. I spent 2 hours doing this. For developers, like I was much more comfortable with it because I'd done things like that before. For like things like the support engineers, it was a little bit harder because I didn't want them to spend so much time just on bookkeeping. Like if they're like, oh, I spent 5 minutes answering this support ticket, and then I spent like 8 minutes answering this support ticket. Like that to me seems very tedious. And I tried to make it so that they could kind of like bundle things and report in a sensible way. But yeah, like it was mainly just kind of like looking at how they were spending their hours and thinking about like whether that matched my expectations. Like, if they worked 15 hours a week and they said that they were spending like 10 of those hours on support tickets, and then I looked and they had, answered 3 questions, then I would be like, hey, like, I think, like, let's talk about what's going on. Like, I think maybe you're putting too many hours into these tickets. And, and I think we did have that with not so much with support engineers, but it would be more with developers where like we would have somebody, there were developers that didn't work out. Like, I would do contract to hire. So most of the people I would hire, like it would be clear after like a week or two, like, hey, this isn't working out. But there were a few where like it wasn't obvious to me until a few weeks later. And so I would see like in their weekly time sheets, it would be like they spent 17 hours fixing a bug that I would expect them to take like an hour and a half on. And I'm like, hey, like this is like way off. Like I think there's just like, unless there's like something I'm misunderstanding about the complexity here, like I think this is just like a skill mismatch for what the role requires. But yeah, it was mostly like just kind of eyeballing it and seeing like, okay, like does that seem sensible? And like sometimes it would be, I always like gave people the benefit of the doubt. I never was like, there are a lot of like time tools that are like, oh, catch your employees like lying to you. They're gonna try to trick you, and I'm like, that's so stupid. Like they're adults, like they're gonna, if they're trying to like trick me, we have bigger problems than timesheets. But I think there were also times where it'd be like, hey, I filed this bug and like you ended up spending like 15 hours on it, and like those are legitimate hours. Like it probably would have taken me a similar amount of time, but it's actually like that bug actually isn't worth 15 hours to me. And so that was a hard thing to figure out, like how to communicate, where like certain bugs I'm like, yeah, it's hard to say like where should you give up? Where should where is it worth investing? When should you check back in? Because I think you could say like you check in every 3 hours or something to see if you keep going, but that interrupts flow as well. So it's hard.
So one thing which I'm thinking about is just in terms of high-level math, there are a few dimensions that are involved in this case. You have some idea about how many orders you're getting per month. You have some idea of how much it costs you to build something, and you would use some sort of projection to say, let's keep N amount of inventory. And then you have some fixed costs, which is you have 6 people working, some full-time, some part-time, but there is some amount of amortized cost per month you could break it down to. And then you have an idea of how much profit you need or how much profit you want to make per device.
Yeah.
So when it came to just projecting the price, projecting how much profit you're anticipating, how much or at what point you want to order next, etc. Can you walk us through what that high-level math looks like?
Oh, no, I was not doing high level math.
The meme that comes to mind is like the like the one with the equations with the blackboard. Yeah, that's a questionable question.
Yeah, I mean, my mental model was like, I was thinking about it, but it was like a very simple heuristic, because my mental model was like, okay, like let's say I'm spending like, you know, $20,000 or $30,000 per month. That might be too high. I forget what the numbers were, but like let's say $20,000 per month was like staff and the office and the things that are gonna like be recurring every month. And then I would say, okay, like just to keep afloat, like I have to sell this many devices. And so that number was, let's say, like 100. And then I'd say, okay, so after 100, like then I'm just making whatever the profit is on the device. I take the price I sold it at minus the cost of the hardware minus what I'm guessing the cost of supporting those customers are in perpetuity or until they practically keep using it. And then like that's going to be my profit for the month. But that was a big problem. Like I always had a really difficult time of just doing the math and figuring out like what is my profitability this month, because so much of my money was being reinvested into the future. So like development, like that's, you know, you could get rid of all the developers and people wouldn't really notice for 6 months. And then after that point, it kind of catches up to you. Yeah. Maybe even a year, people notice like, hey, you're not making any changes to the product.
Hashtag Twitter. Sorry.
But then other things like there's a lot of things like investing in next iteration of the hardware. Like when we would iterate on the hardware, we're spending 6 months or a year before we get to realize the benefits of all that investment and all that work. And so I would have a hard time thinking like, can we afford like I'm putting in like $150,000 into hardware engineering for this next round. And then like, how much more cost is there going to be as we go through the manufacturing process and stuff? So yeah, like I had a hard time of figuring out like in the short term, like how profitable am I? And even when I would look at it at the annual level, like there's still a lot of like future investment that's included in the annual numbers. But yeah, I would be happy if we would be cash flow positive, even though that was like not the truest picture of the health of the business.
And so manufacturing is something that you mentioned here. Whenever you change, let's say the hardware you're working with or the design aspects, do you have to go back and negotiate again with the manufacturer on how to build this or the cost of building it?
So by the time we switched to the contract manufacturer, we had finalized the design. So we didn't really have to change much. I think if we changed it, they would probably give us a new quote and say like, because they have to source a bunch of new components. I think that's like a thing that didn't realize until pretty late, or maybe I couldn't have done much about it anyway, but there's design choices you can make that lower the manufacturing cost. So we ended up having a lot of different circuit boards in the device, and like we could have reduced complexity of building it a lot more by like consolidating everything into one board and like simplifying everything. But there's a big upfront cost of that, of like doing all the
design
electrical
work,
engineering to
Makes sense. Any other pieces of advice for folks who might be working with contract manufacturers or looking to work with them?
I was gonna say I'm very impressed by Ronak's questions. It's like sounds like he's really gonna build out his next hardware startup. I was like, wow.
I know nothing about hardware, and I've on this podcast we have spoken with a few people who do a lot who know a lot about hardware, and almost every single one of them is like, don't do it. So but I think as you mentioned earlier, you've built up a lot of this knowledge over the last few years, and I'm just trying to surface those and see other folks can leverage that.
Yeah, so advice for other people working in hardware, I would say, specifically working with a contract manufacturer, I think the really important thing is having somebody that you trust, because I think the hard part is like when you're working with contract manufacturers overseas, like you can go on like Alibaba and bid out like contracts to a lot of manufacturers there, but like I don't know, at least for me, like I don't know the difference between these companies. Like I can't distinguish between like what's like a reputable skilled company and what's not, because that's just not my domain. And so I really relied on, we worked with electrical engineering partners in the US that we knew, and like we had built up a trusting relationship, and we worked with them to find like, okay, who's going to be like a trustworthy vendor. And so they can tell us like, oh, this vendor has this reputation. Like we've done a lot of work with them in the past. So I think like if you are not somebody that has relationships with contract manufacturers or PCB manufacturers, you really do need somebody that can guide you. There's like kind of a bootstrapping trust problem of like, if you don't know what good looks like how do you know what, like, how do you find an advisor that like, how do you know what a good advisor looks like?
That's true. Yeah.
So I think for us, it was like working with an advisor in the US helps a lot, just because it's within the US, it's much easier to judge like, well, they have like a terrible website, or like they have, it's just like a one-person shop that is like in the back of a van or something, versus like, okay, they have like 50 employees and they work in a real office.
It's also, I think, the lower trust and higher trust society difference. And most of North America and Europe, I would say, is more of a higher trust society. Whereas as you start going east, like in Asia, please Asians don't hate on me, I'm an Asian myself. But trust is a problem, and it's pretty apparent.
On the topic of delegation, I'm quite interested because, right, like reading through your retrospectives, I feel like that has been like kind of a reoccurring theme, right? Like as you've gone through this journey over time, you've learned like, hey, I can delegate this, I can delegate that. Yeah. I'm curious if you've developed like a framework of, it could be the next business you're building, right? Like the new skill sets you're picking up. Mm-hmm. Are there signs that you're looking out for that when you're doing something, you're like, hey, maybe this is something I should consider like delegating?
Yeah, I thought a lot about delegation because my perspective on it changed a lot. When I first started out, I felt like maybe this is like the Tim Ferriss influence of like, oh, just outsource everything I don't want to do. And I realized that for indie business, that's actually really hard, because one of the things that you really need in the early stages is agility and being able to react to things. So if you like start doing something and then you're like, okay, I'm going to find a person and hire them to do it. Now you're so much slower, because like you have to wait on them for results. You have to communicate with them about exactly how you want it done. And so I really learned to like, before there's like revenue or something that's like very promising about the business, my strategy now is to just do everything myself. Unless it's something where like a one-off task, like hiring somebody to make a logo or something.
Right.
But in terms of delegating beyond that, I think it's important to delegate things like once you have a business that's working. So in the case of TinyPilot, it was like, I realized I was spending a lot of time on customer service. And so that was a thing that like it doesn't need, there's like a lot of things about a business that required my particular set of skills, but like customer service is a thing I think I could find somebody else. Like I didn't feel like I had some special advantage in customer service beyond just knowing the product pretty well. But that's a thing I can find somebody to do. And so for my next thing, I think I would look for the things where what's something that like A, I don't enjoy doing that much, B, like doesn't require any like anything that I feel like I'm especially good at. And yeah, like what's taking a lot of my time during the day, like what's absorbing a lot of my bandwidth, and those would be the highest priority things to outsource. So I would imagine like customer service would for most businesses, customer service would be one of the ones that I would outsource quickly. But I also have seen people like use customer service. There's like customer service shops where it's like customer service as a service where you'll like hire a customer service company. And my experience with them is always like my experience with them as a customer is always really bad, because I think you need in an indie business like a tight feedback loop between customer service and the product. Yeah. And in those companies, I think the customer service team like knows they have no power to influence the product. And so it always drives me crazy when I'm like, oh, I'm going to support an indie business, and like I use their product, and then I contact customer support, and it's like very clear they're using like some kind of outsourced customer support that has no relationship, that like has no channel to them. And so if I report an issue, they just will like tell me how to work around it, but they won't. I'm like, no, I'm telling you something that's wrong with the product. Like you should be fixing this. So yeah, like with delegation, I think it's important to make sure you're not delegating so far, especially in the early days where you're still keeping like a tight feedback loop between anything you delegate and like you as the owner and of the product vision.
Nice. I hope this doesn't sound like a BuzzFeed article, but like along those lines, what are some like the top misconceptions, I guess, about like running an indie business?
I think that the most prevalent misconception is how great it is. And I think it's like, I think there are a lot of things about running an indie business that are great and I really like, but I think there's been this like kind of this similar to like the Instagram effect where there's like this heightened reality that people present online. And I meet people at meetups that want to start an indie business or like have tried to start an indie business, and their expectations are so high for what it's going to be like. Like they hear these stories about people like quitting their jobs and like 6 months later they're making $100,000 a month from some SaaS business. And they're like, that sounds great. Like I want to do that. And I met a guy at a meetup a couple of years ago, and he was like, yeah, like I think I'm like, I've got some customers, but you know, like we've got a lot of users. They seem really enthusiastic, but like, we're just not making money. So I think I'm just going to like, I'm going to give it up and like go back to working for a big company. And like the way he was talking, he sounded so grizzled and like distraught that I was like, oh man, he seems like he's been at it for like 5 years or something. He's so burned out. And I was like, how long have you been doing this? And he was like, 3 months. I was like, 3 months? I was like, you have like active users after 3 months and like you're disappointed? As I think there's like multiple levels to it. Like I think a lot of people just aren't talking about their results. So I think if you're doing poorly, like you're just not going to talk about it publicly. And the people that are doing well, like they're going to talk about it a lot. And I think the channels where you find out about these stories, like they also, even if there's a distribution of people that are doing okay and really great, like the people that are doing really great are going to get a lot more attention. And I think there's likely people also like exaggerating results, probably like some people like outright lying about results. But I think I've seen people use like little tricks where they're like, oh, my like monthly revenue is like 100,000. And then I'm like, you're saying like revenue, like pre-fees that Stripe takes out or pre-fees that Gumroad takes out, where Gumroad takes out like 10% or something. And so I think people are like, oh, I want to, you know, have a high number. So I'm just going to say, so I think that's the biggest misconception is like people go into it thinking like, this is going to be a great time. Like I'm going to, you know, throw off the yoke I've been working under as like my big tech job, and I'm going to have such a fun time. And I think like I prefer being an indie founder. Like a recruiter from Google reached out to me like 3 months ago and was like, you can have your old job back with no interview. And I was like, no, I'm zero tempted to do that. But I think you have to go into it expecting it's going to be hard, and like it's going to be hard in ways that are very different than working. I've only really worked in big tech, and so like the challenges of being a solo founder for an indie business are very different than the challenges of working in big tech. And it's kind of like higher highs, lower lows. So it's just very different, and like different people have dispositions that make them suited for one versus the other. Or sometimes you just like catch being an indie business, like you're much more vulnerable to luck. And so like if you have a lower tolerance to just like going a year and not really seeing much progress, like that's going to probably burn you out in a way that you wouldn't if you were working in big tech and were making consistent salary.
So in this specific market, it's really hard for people to find a job. And 3 months ago, you got this call from the Google recruiters like, hey, you can have your old job back and no interview required. Why say no? And so last time we spoke, you shared your reasons for why you wanted to do any business yourself. Have those reasons evolved since after you've done TinyPilot?
I don't think so. I think probably just I've become more confident in the same reasons. Like I really like having control over my day and getting to decide what I want to work on, and like getting to decide what direction I want to take the product and where I want to, like that was the thing before I started, like before I quit my job at Google and I was just like listening to podcasts about indie founders. The thing I thought was so cool was just how they had complete control. Like you're like, oh, I've got $20,000 in monthly revenue, and so I can use that to hire a developer and make the product better, or I can use that to invest in marketing and find more customers and get even more money. And you can like do really creative things with it. Like you can make like a viral video that or some kind of like clever marketing. And I find that part of it extremely fun. Like you have so much more freedom to do that than if you're working in big tech, where like you're very limited to what the role you were hired for is. And so I think that to me is like probably the biggest reason. And I also really like, even though, so the blog post I wrote about selling TinyPilot, one of the Hacker News comments was like, oh, like he actually made a bad choice because had he just stayed at Google, he would have made more money. And I'm like, well, no, like I'm not optimizing for most money, and like it's more satisfying to me to make $200,000 a year and knowing that I'm capturing the full value of that, rather than like maybe I'm working for Google and I'm making $400,000 a year, but I feel like I'm actually generating like $2 million in value. And so I'm like, oh, it sucks that like I'm not really getting the full value of what I'm doing, and I'm like giving so much of my work to somebody else because they're in this position of employer. And I think that's another big thing that I really like about being an indie founder, is like knowing that there's not this distinction between like the value that you create and the value that you get to capture. And like that was a really frustrating part of working for Google. Not so much the value, but feeling like the gap in incentives. Like a lot of times the thing that was right for me at Google was not the thing that was right for my team or for the company. And I didn't like having to choose between like, do I do the right thing to help my teammates, or do I do the right thing for my career? Whereas if it's your business, those things are aligned, and you can also, I mean, Google has a hard problem of trying to align incentives among like 100,000 employees. But if it's your company and it's a small company, it's a lot easier to set things up so that everybody's incentives are aligned. Like you have a reason to help your teammates, and like you can all grow together in a way where it's not like zero sum.
That's really well put. I haven't thought about value capture in that sense, but yeah, you're right. It's very demotivating, right? If you're only able to capture like 5% of the value that you create,
right?
It's kind of like,
right.
Okay, if I'm pulling all these, I'm putting in all this time just to create that extra value, but if I can't capture it, there's and
Google actually had this program when I was there called Area 120, where it was like it's a startup within Google. Like we'll let you like spend 6 months creating your own startup, and we'll give you Google resources. And I was like, well, like that's kind of cool, but like if it takes off, then what happens? Like if you are outside Google and you create Dropbox, like you're the founder of $1 billion company and you're worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Like if you create this IP within Google and it takes off, like Google owns all of that, and like maybe they'll be nice to you and give you bonuses or something, but you're really at their mercy. Whereas if you're a founder and like it works, like that, the ball is completely in your court. Like you get to decide what to do with that.
Yeah. As someone that's sort of going through a similar process, I think you're like a role model to me, but also to other people, is because this like combination of authenticity and being real about like the hardness of like the journey, but at the same time, it's like the okay, I can't speak English, but optimism of like, right? Like I said this in the last, in our last chat, but just like how you're like, oh, after the first year, right? It's like, I made like negative money, but like I'm having like the best, I do not regret it. And this is like the best.
Right.
So that has been like super, I think, inspiring, to hear. So.
Well, I mean, one thing I want to say about that is that like, I think I'm also guilty of presenting like a more heightened reality. Like I don't try to exaggerate like, wow, everything's going great for me. But the thing that's hard is like when 7 people or 6 people were working with me, and there would be times where like I'm having a really bad time, like it felt like a betrayal to the team to be saying like, oh, this has been a really hard month for me. Like I'm really not enjoying myself, because they then have to work with me. And so I struggled with like, I don't want to like mislead people and put on this persona of like everything's going great, I'm super happy, but I also don't want to like bum my team out and have them be like, ooh, like sorry that like you're so stressed by like this manufacturing defect or something. And so I had a hard time like figuring out what the right level of candor is in the blog. Of like I do want to share as much as possible, and like I want to share how it really is, but I also want to do things that make people understand that there's limitations where I can't share like 100%, and there's going to be things that readers can't see that are going on.
Nice. Okay, doing a little bit of a pivot.
Sure.
So talking about the selling process. So you wrote a very nice blog post. We'll link it on the selling process. There were funny cartoons for the due diligence, which I think was the bane of the entire process.
Yeah, it was really hard.
So the part that stuck out to me, I'm sure Rana has other questions on this as well, was like the question that you asked yourself. It's like, do I feel a loss of identity? I'm just going to read it verbatim because I thought you put it super well. So you said that I've heard other founders say that they struggle with the loss. Sorry, I can't speak English. With the loss of identity after they sold their business. Others say it feels like they've given up on their baby. I didn't feel a change in identity or a sense of deep loss. I always run TinyPilot like a modest small business rather than a world-changing startup. I'm proud of TinyPilot and put a lot of care into the company, but it was never a blood, sweat, and tears thing for me. So on the work front, like, what is your identity, and how did you like build that over the last years?
I still think of myself as a developer mainly. Like when I meet people and they ask me what I do, I say developer. Well, also because it's hard to explain. Like I'm an indie founder and I have a blog that some people read. But yeah, like I mainly think of myself as a developer. And like after I sold the company, I plan to keep writing software and build a business out of that. I think some of these hard questions are for like bigger deals, like people that sold their company for $60 million and they're like, oh, what do I do now? Like, who am I? Like, how should I use this money? So for me, like, you know, the sale was for $600,000, which is like a significant amount of money, but it's not like I'm going to retire and go live on a beach someplace. And so the identity part of it felt like, yeah, I'm just going to keep doing what I've been doing. Like I'm going to continue trying to do different software projects and build a business around them.
Nice.
So I have some questions about the logistics of the setting process itself. I read in the post, by the way, that you mentioned TinyPilot only took 20% of your time, but 90% of the stress. Um,
Yeah.
Wait, so 20% of the time, how?
I mean, 20% of like 168 hours a week. So
Ah, okay,
like
okay.
30 or 40 hours a week.
I see. Okay, that part makes sense. But one thing that you mentioned earlier, and you, by the way, uh, plus one to what Guang was saying, there's a lot of transparency in that post, and you've shared real numbers, which
Yeah.
thank you for doing that. It's not
Oh,
common
sure.
or easy for anyone to do that. Um,
Yeah.
so you mentioned broker, for example. In this case,
Yep.
what does that look like typically? Like, how do you find one? Did someone reach out to you?
Yeah, I did have brokers reach out, and they didn't seem like they were going to lead to a sale. And so I reached out to FE International, which I had heard things about them from SaaS founders, but I'd never heard about them selling a business that did a physical product. But they were kind of the only broker I knew of that worked with bootstrap founders. And so I talked back and forth with one of the advisors at FE International, and they were like, "No, like you actually can't. I don't think I could find a buyer for you unless you were selling 10 different products where no single product made up more than like 30% of your revenue."
Oh
And he's
wow.
like, you should look into like USB cables and chargers and diversify your numbers that way. And I was like, USB cables? Like, how am I going to do that? And so I was like, when he told me that I think that was like late 2022. And I was freaked out because I was like, wait, am I just like, I'm like, this is the only brokerage I know that they were like my best hope. And I was like, is there really no path to selling TinyPilot? Because like the only broker I know that would cater to me is saying like the only way to sell is if I become like the USB cable king. Like I don't know how this is gonna work. And then fortunately I went to MicroConf, which is like a bootstrap founder conference, and it was my first year going, and I met this brokerage, Quiet Light Brokerage, and one of the advisors there, Chris Guthrie. And but even before I started saying I was interested in selling a business, I was kind of feeling out the different advisors just to see who I would get along with. And I like Chris. He was like a very laid back guy, and seemed kind of like on the same wavelength as me. And then when I told him I was interested in selling, he was like, yeah, like I think this is a business I could help you sell. And so then we started working together, and it was a pretty long process because that summer I got married, and I also didn't want to, like, I didn't want to be like in the weeks leading up to my wedding or like on my wedding day being like, oh, like the buyer has a counter offer. So I was like, it's either going to be like a few months before the wedding or like after we've already come back from our honeymoon. So we ended up actually doing it. We like did it for real in October after the honeymoon and everything.
Okay. At what point did you decide that you wanted to sell?
I don't know. I don't know when I decided like for sure I was going to sell. I had been thinking about it in 2022, just like, well, what is the path out of this if I don't want to run the business forever? And I think as the business evolved, like I think there are founders, like I've heard that there are founders that are good for like getting the business from 0 to 10,000 in revenue and then 10,000 to 100. And I felt like I was probably the right founder for the early stages and maybe not the right founder for the later stages, because the things that I expected to do to get to the next level of sales were things that I didn't think I was especially good at, like sales and marketing. Like I think I did kind of like I think I did okay at marketing. Like we successfully partnered with some like YouTube creators and did successful marketing that way. But I think there's probably a lot more in terms of like being able to talk to big distributors and like resellers and stuff that I just had no idea about. And so like I felt like we were eventually kind of going to hit a wall where like my skills weren't the right match. And a lot of the things that I thought that I would need to do to get to that next level were things that like I don't really enjoy doing. Like it was taking me farther and farther away from the software and more pushing me more towards like managing people and hiring vendors and things like that. And so like once that started happening, I was thinking more and more about like, okay, like is there some path where I sell to like somebody who has a related business and like TinyPilot is useful to them, or somebody who's like another founder that wants to swap places with me.
It's interesting, right? Like money always comes back, right? Like in the earlier, when you were talking about like the person on Hacker News saying like, oh, you would have made more money if you stayed at Google. It's like the same thing here. If you're optimizing for money, like then you need to pick up these skill sets that you don't actually want to learn.
Yeah.
It does take a lot of, you have to be very clear about what you want out of this whole thing to kind of stay the course.
I think I would have been comfortable, like if I knew for the next 10 years we could make $250,000 in profit, that was around what we did in 2024. I think I wouldn't have been like, oh, we have to keep growing it. But I think with hardware, there is so much variance that like, even if you have 1 year where, oh, we made $250,000, it's like, well, there's so many risks that we can't just sit back and expect to keep making that, or because there could be like some manufacturing issue. Like we kind of need to like save for a rainy day, or like continue getting to the scale where, because that's the other thing, like the smaller you are, like the less leverage you have with vendors. And so like you're going to deal with a lot of issues that are annoying just because you're a small vendor without a lot of control. Whereas like if you got a little bit bigger, like it gets a lot easier for you. Like, and that was the experience we had with moving to the contract manufacturer. It's like, this is so much better than, in almost every way, it is like so much better than having to make it in our office. But you also, like, to get to that point, like we had to make it in our office. We had to, like, if we had approached them at the beginning, they would have been like, no, we're not making like 40 devices for you. So it's, it's tough.
Nice.
So in this case, like when you decided finally to actually sell the business in working with Chris, how do you go about figuring out the price, or what does that process look like? And just to give some context, I've only done maybe 2 big purchases in my life. One is a car and the second one is a house. I'm sure this looks like something like the 2 of those, and I'm sure this is true for many listeners too. So can you walk us through what that process looks like?
Yeah, it is, I think, a little bit arbitrary. When I talk to brokers and I talked to like other founders who had been through this process, they were kind of like, okay, there's like a multiple for your category, and then you're going to sell within like the range of that multiple. So, well, first you calculate your, I think different brokerages do it different ways. Some do EBITDA, which I can never pronounce. QuietLight does it based on seller's discretionary earnings. So it's basically like you calculate your profit, and you correct for things where like you correct for like inventory that you bought but haven't sold yet, and so you like adjust the numbers to basically like accrual accounting, so that you're not counting that against your profits. And then you also add back anything where it's not like a recurring expense. So for example, like the web design stuff, like because that was like a one-time cost, it doesn't, you can make the case that it's not like, it shouldn't really count against your recurring profits. So like if you spent, or like if your office exploded one day and you had to spend $50,000 like fixing it, that doesn't mean that you're like $50,000 less profitable in the future. And so and even that is like a little bit, it's a little bit subjective, because it's like, okay, you did spend this money and like you do eventually have to, anyway.
It's discretionary profit in a way.
Yeah, you come up with this number that's like, here's what I think the next owner could reasonably expect to make per year, and they could decide what to do with that money. And then from that number, you have a multiple based on what similar businesses are selling like in the industry. And so at the time I was selling, the multiple was like for e-commerce business was like 2.5 to 3.5 times SDE. And so I think when we first started selling, we were at like 196 in SDE or something. And so it's like, okay,
sorry, what did SDE stand for?
Seller's discretionary earnings.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, so if you're making around $200,000 in SDE, then the valuation would be 2.5 to 3.5 times that. So like somewhere in the range of like 550 to 650. But you can get a little bit of a higher valuation if it's from a strategic acquirer. So that was one of the companies that we approached. We like found a company that was in a similar market to TinyPilot. I actually approached a few companies and I was like, hey, like you're in a similar market. And I was hoping that they would see the valuation as like 4x or 5x because it's like, oh, our two products together, like they would be super valuable. But the problem with this company I approached, they'd never done an acquisition before and like kind of didn't know that much about it. And so it was a lot of back and forth over 4 months. And they finally came back with a number that was $150,000. I was like, that's less than 1x earnings. Like I would make more just running the company for another year. And they were like, oh yeah, like we think this is fair. And so
Oh, wow.
ended up, but yeah, like I think the pricing, I think it is, I think from going through the experience of buying and selling houses, like I think it is actually kind of similar. You try to look for things that have sold around the same time, and you're like, okay, well that sold for this amount, so like I'm willing to offer this.
I see. So in this case, like the final sale that happened, was it the company reaching out to you, or did you happen to find a company that would be interested in TinyPilot?
So I went through the brokerage, and that was the main value that the brokerage brings. So they're good at guiding you through the process, especially for a first-time founder. Like I found that really valuable, but the main thing where like I feel like they really earn their commission is finding a buyer. So they have a mailing list of people that are interested in buying companies. And so when they are ready to like, they call it launching a new company, they go through this process of like, they collect a bunch of data from you about your finances. They put together like profit and loss statements, and they do a little interview with you, and you fill out like a really detailed questionnaire. And so they publish it on their website, and then they send out to all their email subscribers like, hey, we've got a new company on the market. Here's a little blurb about them. And then if you're interested in talking to them, reach out to us and we'll set up conversations.
I see. And are there any I'm assuming there are some negotiations involved. So is it directly with you and the company who's buying, or is it always through the broker?
So like the thing that officially kicks off, like the kind of like the engagement ring of the sale is the LOI, the letter of intent. And so that's like, generally the buyer will say like, I want you to sign this letter of intent, and like that binds you to me. Like you can't try to sell to other people while we're in due diligence. So that starts the due diligence process and gets you to the final sale. But yeah, in my case, like most of the negotiation happened before we signed the letter of intent. For the first 2 months, it was pretty slow. And then in month 3, like 2 buyers kind of appeared at the same time. And one was Scott, who was the ultimate buyer. And the other was this pair of founders that I actually found. They approached me. So that was unusual in that they went outside the broker. But they both seemed interested. And we were like, well, we're asking for $600,000. And Scott was like, okay, I'll offer you $500,000. And I was like, I don't know, like since we set the number, like our profit's been a little bit better. Like I think we're now a 3x multiple would be 625. And we pre-qualified for an SBA loan, which it means that buyers can get a loan that's backed by the U.S. Small Business Administration. And that opens up the buyer pool a lot. So I was like, okay, like from when we first offered it, like we're in a much better position. So like, I'm not going to take 500,000. And so I told Scott no. And then the next day, the other 2 buyers just backed out. I was like, oh, uh-oh. I was like, I was feeling like really high, like feeling like in a really great position that first day. And then the other buyers backed out, and I was like, uh-oh, like maybe 500,000 was the best I was going to get. And then, fortunately, like a day or 2 later, Scott was like, oh no, okay, I'll do 600,000. I was like, okay, wow. Great negotiating by me by doing almost nothing. And so, yeah, we moved forward in the deal at 600,000.
Awesome. That's awesome. I mean, congratulations again.
Thanks.
When it finally happened, what did it feel like in that moment?
It actually didn't feel that real in the moment because leading up to it, I was so anxious so due diligence took 3 months. And like, even now that sounds like a short amount of time to me, but at the time it felt really stressful because it's just like, you're constantly being asked to produce documents. And I knew every day, like normally if somebody's like, hey, can you like send me a report on whatever, it's generally like, okay, I can get to that this week. But with this, it's like, okay, I mean, I don't know what was really going on, but I'm assuming the bank is like, well, we're not going to move to the next step until like you give us this. So the buyer was buying with the SBA loan, working with a bank. So some of the requests are coming directly from the buyer of things he wants to make sure are like in good shape about the business. And some of the requests are coming from the bank of like, they want to make sure they're not loaning money on like some terrible investment. And so, yeah, like so I get some of these requests and I'm like, oh, like if I take like 2 or 3 days to respond, like I'm probably effectively pushing back the closing date by 2 or 3 days. So like, I really feel a lot of pressure to get this done. And there's just so many requests. Like the more they learn about the business, the more questions they have, and like the more custom, like kind of like specialized questions they have about the business. And I'm also like very protective of our customer data. And so I didn't want to be like, sure, like here's a Shopify account, just like do whatever you want in our account. And so it was a lot of like, they would ask something and I have to go into our bank statements or go into our Shopify and like find an answer for them and find a way of giving them the information without like revealing customer names or vendor names and stuff. So yeah, it was stressful. But, oh, sorry, you asked what it felt like if it was finally done. Yeah, like it was weird. Like I felt like it didn't feel real because the weeks leading up, I think I was always worried that like something was going to happen where the bank was going to say no, or something was going to happen where like the buyer was going to decide to back out for some reason. And so I was just like constantly worried about like, oh, what could go wrong here? And then like, what position will I be left in if I've like taken my eye off the ball of the business to focus so much on the sale? Like I'm going to be in a worse position to sell to somebody else. And then like when we finally got all the yeses from the bank and they said like, okay, final approval, they said we can close. I think it was 10 days after that. But that whole 10 days, I was just like, I didn't know what to do with myself. Yeah. And like, I didn't really even know what to do. Cause I'm like, should I work? Like at that point, I'm just kind of like doing free work for the buyer. And we'd already done a lot of work to prepare and like get our documentation ready and like build all these like tools to make it easier for them to take over. So I'm like, it doesn't seem like it makes sense to work. And then it also doesn't make sense. Like there's another strategy where I like work on contingency plans of like, what happens if this deal falls through? And both of them were so like depressing or boring that I just didn't do either and would just ruminate about like, oh no, like what if it doesn't happen? And so when we finally, when we finally did like get the signature, I just felt like I was still in that state of like, oh, what could go wrong? And like, in theory, the deal was final. Like once the papers were signed, that should be it. But I was like, I don't know how this works. Like maybe there's something where like he's going to come back a week later and be like, hey, I changed my mind. Like let's unwind this. And so it really took me a few weeks before I felt like, okay, like it's done. Like I've handed off I passed the torch to somebody else. And so I think the day of, like, logically, I felt very happy that the sale happened, and like the few days after, I was celebrating with friends and my wife. But I think it wasn't until like 3 weeks later where I was like, okay, like this is nice. Like I feel good about, like, the transition went really smoothly. The new owner seemed to have like a good hold on everything. And so I just felt like, okay, like now I can kind of relax. And I think from like weeks 3 to 6, we're like getting from like feeling mostly relaxed to feeling like totally relaxed and feeling like, okay, this is somebody else's business now.
Nice. I remember hearing people talking about this, where it's like, oh, if there's multiple bidders, you don't actually want to necessarily go for the one that pays you the most money, but like the sort of the buyer that has like the best fit, or like that, has a lot of goodwill.
Yeah.
And it was really your post though that really drove home like, okay, why is that?
Yeah, that was always really important to me. Like I told the broker from the beginning, like I definitely don't want to sell to private equity. I didn't want to sell to somebody where it's like, oh yeah, we're just gonna like, fire all the developers and just squeeze money of the product until people realize that like we haven't invested anything in it. And like I wanted somebody that was gonna keep the team and keep investing in the product. And I asked other founders for advice, and they were like, well, you can't really control that. Like once the new buyer takes over, like it's really up to them. And I think there's like, that's true, but I think you can also look at the track record of the people that are buying. Like
Right.
if their history is like, the company that bought Travis CI, like when they bought Travis CI, everybody's like, uh-oh, this is bad. Because they had like in their wake a ton of companies that they had just squeezed and destroyed. And like Travis CI like definitely went that way. Like they really stopped investing in it. So that was, front of mind in the conversations with buyers is like, do you want to keep investing in the company? Like, what's the future you see for the company? And like the buyer that I sold to, like, he was like, yes, I think like, I really like the model that you have. I want to continue that and basically make it bigger. And that has been, I mean, it's short time scale so far, but like, that's been the impression I've gotten as the transition continues.
It was quite cool to hear because he's also kind of similar in that he like was working at a big company and then quit, and then he's like the VP of like it's like more like BD, right, like on the business development side.
Yeah,
and
I
then
think so.
he's gonna nice. So I think it's like a pretty cool like the 1 million to 10 million thing, like you said.
Yeah.
Awesome. Like the last thing that we want to get to. So you're very, very good at Hacker News. In the last 5 years, more than 40 of your posts have got to the front page, and 7 of them have landed in the #1 spot. In fact, you've written a book about this back in 2020, which we kind of talked about a little bit in the last conversation. Then yesterday, you announced that you're doing this like 6-week course teaching people on how to hit the front page for Hacker News. I actually signed up for it.
I saw, thank
you. I don't know when the thing will come out, when the recording, but hopefully, there's still a chance for people to sign up. If they listen to this in time. But like what prompted you to start teaching a course about this?
Yeah, so originally it was a course. It wasn't the original was a course, but the material felt like I created the course right around the time that TinyPilot was starting to gain traction, and I was like, this is going to be easy. Like I already, I don't have to research anything. That's just going to be a course of like basically a brain dump of everything I already know. And then as I started doing it, I was like, oh, it's actually hard to do. Like just hard making slides and like figuring out how to divide up the lessons in the way that I want and like get good recordings where I'm not stumbling or misspeaking too much. And so I ended up feeling like I was happy with the material, but I felt like I could have done a lot more with it if I had more time. And also like, I just never marketed it at all. Like I showed it to my Twitter followers, and I don't even know if I mentioned it on my blog, but yeah, like I felt like, and just with TinyPilot was so busy that first few months that I just like, was like, well, obviously the thing I need to focus on is TinyPilot because like that's the more pressing thing. But now I'm like, well, like I've sold TinyPilot, and I felt like, yeah, like I kind of wanted to revisit that. And I don't think I feel like maybe I'm falling into the same trap. I'm like, it doesn't seem like it's going to be that much work to re-record it and like update it a little bit for 2024. And it also like my wife and I are expecting our first child in August. And so it's the kind of like recording this course. Oh, thank you. I think recording a course is a pretty good match for that, because it's like, if I launched a SaaS and then it blew up or something, and like now I have to step away to care for my wife and a baby, like that's not great timing. Whereas a course, like at worst, I just step away from the course. It's not like if I suddenly get 1,000 customers, like that's a big problem, because it's just like the course is online and people download it. So that kind of business to me is like a really nice match for like, I don't know what my hours are going to be like, and I don't know if I'm going to be called away. And so, yeah, like this is kind of me dipping my toe into the water of like educational materials again, and maybe I'll do other courses or some kind of book. There's a lot of things I would love to explore more and write about.
Nice. I like, for one thing I've learned from the writing is this like show don't tell thing that they taught in high school, but really never really like struck me until now. But it's like a sense of like especially I think works well for Reddit and Hacker News, as you pointed out, like where you show what you've done rather than trying to tell people like how to do things.
Yeah.
Like I to me I feel like it's like an easy trap, because a lot of times like you learn to do stuff from your experience, and then you kind of internalize it, you think about it, and then you kind of tell yourself, right? Like, hey, these are the things how you should do it, right? So you try to sort of import or export that same tone, and then in like writing, and then people's like, why are you trying to tell me all this like these things? So I think being able to like switch that mindset has been like really huge.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've learned, and I feel like people kind of overlook. Like, I think often people are excited to share, like they'll make some kind of software project and they're excited to share it, and they're like, I'm going to write a blog post about how cool my project is. And I think people have a negative and skeptical reaction to that. So if you write a blog post being like, my SaaS app, like I made a video editor and it's like so great in these ways, people are going to be like, I don't know, like it's probably not. And like, you're making claims that everybody makes. And what I found that actually gets people more interested is like, you say something, you're not saying like, oh, my product is so great. You say like, here's some interesting experience I had when I was building this product. So with TinyPilot, it was like, I wasn't like, hey, everybody, I like made TinyPilot, it's the greatest thing ever. It was like, I had this idea and like, I tried this video capture thing that didn't work. Then I found this other piece of hardware, and so people really responded to like, oh, that's cool that you like took us on the journey and like you learned interesting things along the way. And I feel like that's a really underused skill that people don't take advantage of, is like, if you want people to pay attention to your product, like don't go the direct route of trying to brag about it, go the route of like sharing something interesting that you learned in the process of making it.
Nice. I'm looking forward to the course.
Yeah, me too.
Well, that's really well said. By the way, is there one thing that you could share with folks about the course? One tip that you would share with people who are blogging but may not be able to join the course?
Yeah. Let's see. What's a good like nugget? I mean, one of the biggest things that I had to learn the hard way is that when you write like a blog post or any kind of article, it's not enough for it to just be a good article. Like, you have to have some way of getting it in front of the people that are a good match for it. So like, if I wrote like a really great introduction to Kubernetes, and it was like the greatest introduction ever, that like made it make sense to people that have never done anything with containers, but I published it in my like local town's newspaper, like people aren't going to read that, because like that's not people in my town. Maybe there's a few developers, like it's just not going to get in front of the people that need to see that. And so I think people like kind of just assume that like if you write a good article, people will find their way to it, and that really isn't the way it works. Like, you need some kind of channel that's going to connect the people to your article. So so for some people that's Twitter, and so for some people that's Hacker News or Reddit. But I would write a lot of articles like when I started blogging, and it would just be like super niche. Like, it would be like, oh, here's how, like, if you're trying to what was it, like I think it was like some video streaming player called Clipbucket, like here's how you do it if you're trying to deploy it on like Google Cloud Project using GCS views. And I would publish it, and I'm like, well, like I guess that's actually a separate issue. It's like you're publishing something that's too niche. But I think there's this problem of like, for example, like blogging. Like I enjoy writing about blogging, but I don't have any really channel, like aside from like making a course. If I just write an article about like, you know, what I'm saying right now, like I don't have a good channel to share that, because like the communities that are about blogging, like usually don't let you just submit blog posts about blogging, because so many people are trying to do that. And so you really need to think through, like, maybe you have like a really great thing to say about blogging or about some topic, but if you don't have a channel that is going to let you share that and is going to connect you with a lot of people that with a lot of people in your target audience, like you're not going to get people to read it. Like, maybe you're going to find people through Google, but like certain articles are things that people will search for in Google, and certain things like nobody's going, like there's certain topics where people aren't going, like might be interested in them, but they're not going to just Google like, oh, I want to read a critique of like this technology. It's hard for them to find that. Even if they might actually be interested in it, they wouldn't think to look that up.
Yeah. Well, that's really good advice. And Michael, thank you so much again for joining us. Your journey
thank you so much for having me.
Journey has been super inspiring. Congratulations again for everything. Selling TinyPilot, getting married, and expecting the first baby. We're super excited for you and what's ahead of you. And hopefully in, let's say, a year or two, you're doing something else. And we would love to have you back on the show.
Yeah, I'd love to come back.
Awesome.
And hopefully I'm doing something interesting enough to talk about.
For sure.
I'm sure.
Thank you so much, Michael. This was a lot of fun.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Hey, thank you so much for listening to the show. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and learn more about us at softwaremisadventures.com. You can also write to us at hello@softwaremisadventures.com. We would love to hear from you. Until next time, take care.